Chapter 18. The summer came and went. Anxious to get home, Allan often asked about the whaling ships. He wanted the hunters to be sure and tell him if they ever saw such a ship. He himself often went to the edge of the open sea, hoping to spot one of the whalers, but he was always disappointed. In the meantime, Allan accompanied the hunters in their search for food. One day he helped in the killing of a polar bear. Intuk and Crickvik and Erik and Uta had gone out on the ice. As they were halted in one particular spot, looking for the breathing holes of seals, the dogs began to set up a terrible racket. They had obviously gotten the scent of something. Intuk jumped up on top of the sled and examined the ice that stretched away in front of him. "Nanook!" he shouted, jumping down from the sled. He went to unleash the dogs, but the animals were so excited that they got all tangled up in each other's traces. Intuk did not wait to unravel them, but quickly drew his knife and slashed the sealskin reins, setting each dog free. When the last of the 6 dogs went bounding off over the ice, the hunters got the other sled and team ready and took off in pursuit of the free-running dogs. The dogs of the second sled were just as excited about the chase, and the men had a hard time keeping up with them. Meanwhile, somewhere ahead on the ice, the dogs had caught up with the bear. The hunters could hear the constant hysterical barking that meant the dogs had encircled their prey, and they soon came on evidence that the dogs were not having it all their own way. A dark brown bundle of fur on the trail proved to be one of the dogs. The bear had broken the animal's neck with a slash of its paw. The hunters could now see the dogs running in circles around the bear. Every once in a while a dog would rush in and try to bite the polar bear, but the larger animal would easily withstand the rush. The bear had absolutely no fear of the smaller animals. As far as the bear was concerned, the dogs were just a nuisance blocking his way. The sled came hissing up to the scene, and Intuk yelled at Allan to take charge of the dogs and sled. It was all Allan could do to keep the dogs under control. Meanwhile, the 4 hunters had drawn their weapons from the sled. Intuk, who had first spotted the bear, was the first to approach. To him was given the honor of first strike. Intuk held his lance at the ready and carefully edged closer and closer, waiting for the right moment. A dog made a rush, and the bear reared on its hind legs. Intuk ran forward and threw the lance with all his might. The weapon struck home, but the bear angrily pawed at the handle until the lance worked loose. Blood began pumping from the wound, but the bear ignored the spreading red stain on his fur, dropping to all fours, and charged Intuk. Instantly the dogs attacked and forced the bear to halt. The other 3 hunters were ready, and one by one they advanced as close as they could to the bear before hurling their weapons. By the time the last hunter had made his thrust, the bear was sitting down with 3 lances in his body. Intuk now took the killing spear from the sled and advanced to within a few feet of the animal. Then rapidly, so fast that the eye could hardly follow his arm movements, Intuk stabbed the animal's chest with the point of the spear 3 times. One of the stabs pierced the animal's heart. Blood rushed from that fearful mouth, and it was all over. Soon they had the animal cleaned, skinned, and loaded on the sled. It was a happy group of hunters who made their way back to camp. One polar bear could keep the whole tribe in meat for weeks. Allan was to take part in several bear hunts after that one, and take his turn, along with the other hunters, in hurling the spear. The tribe moved around quite a bit during the summer months. They made 2 week-long camps at a lake where low stone walls had been built to capture Arctic char coming in from the ocean to spawn. The hunters guided the fish into a large shallow pool and then closed the entrance with rocks once the fish were all inside. Then they waded in with fish spears and stabbed downward every time a fish was spotted. Soon the ground around the pool was piled high with the gleaming bodies of large fish. Everyone ate fish until they could hold no more. The rest of the fish were gutted and hung on lines to dry. They would be used in the winter, food for the dogs as well as people. Another special camp was made for a week, while the hunters went out in their kayaks every day to a particular small island to hunt walrus. Every day a walrus was harpooned and brought back to shore to add to the tribe's supply of food. Walrus tusks were highly prized by the hunters, for they made excellent sled runners, and the tip of a walrus tusk made a strong, hard point for a harpoon. For 1 2-week period all the hunters went inland after caribou. They stalked these deer-like animals with a bow and arrow. Allan accompanied the hunters, although he was not much help to them. He did not know how to use the bow and arrow, and he was not very good at stalking. In fact, the hunters thought so little of Allan's abilities that they would not even trust him with one of their bows. Allan was determined to learn, however, and borrowed one of the children's bows to practice with. When it seemed as though he would never learn to use the weapon, when his arrows flew every which way except where he was aiming, Allan would think of Bunty Duff. The master was right, he would scold himself. You're a stupid clod without brains enough to cover a sixpence. And once he said that, he would get very angry at the master and decide it was the master who was stupid and not Allan. And someday Allan would go back to Aberdeen and prove it to old Bunty. Someday he would go back and make the master eat his words. And then Allan would go back to practicing on the bow and arrow. Eventually he became a fairly good shot with the weapon and was able to go out on his own and sometimes bring back a snow hare, or a goose, or duck, or some other water bird. During the winter months, when the sea was frozen over, the men lived mainly on seal meat. They went out on the ice almost every day, looking for the rounded small snow domes that meant the breathing hole of a seal. Then a hunter would crouch motionless over the hole, for hours and even a whole day sometimes, his harpoon at the ready, waiting for a seal to come to the hole to breathe. As soon as the seal poked his head up through the ice, the hunter struck with his harpoon. The shaft of the harpoon would fall off, but the spear point, attached to a rope, would be lodged inside the animal's body. Eventually the seal would tire and the hunter would fish the animal back to the hole and up on the ice. Seals used many holes for breathing and might not come to a particular hole in the ice for days. They had extremely sharp hearing and could sense the slightest movement on top of the ice, which was why it was important for the hunter to remain absolutely still. Although Allan often tried, he was never able to kill a seal at a breathing hole. He was not patient enough and simply could not stand still for hours the way Intuk or Uta or Crickfoot could. There was another way of hunting seals, and that was possible in the spring when the sea ice began to break up and the seals no longer had to use breathing holes. The animals would come up through a crack or an open lead of water, heave themselves out, and bask on the ice. At the slightest hint of danger, they would slide right back into the water. When the seals were basking or lying on the ice, the hunters would stalk them by pretending to be a seal. A hunter would lie on his side on the ice, with one hand slightly raised to imitate a seal's flipper. As long as the seal had his head down, the hunter would wriggle closer, an inch or two at a time. When the seal looked up, the hunter would freeze in position and pretend to be another seal. It usually took hours, but the hunter would finally work his way closer and closer until he was so near that he could reach out and touch the animal. When the hunter got that close, he stabbed with the harpoon and hung on to the rope. Allan was no good at this kind of hunting either. He simply did not have the patience to lie on the ice for hours at a stretch, pretending to be a seal. Allan found himself in a strange position in the tribe. He knew that with certain kinds of hunting he would only hold the hunters back if he went along. He never forgot one late summer afternoon when a flight of geese came in low over their tents and landed on the waters of the bay. Uta and Eric got their bows and arrows and started for the beach. Allan followed them, with a bow and a case of arrows that he borrowed from one of the older children. While still a good distance from the beach, both hunters got down on their bellies and started to squirm forward. Allan followed their example, but Uta waved him back. It was plain that Uta did not want him along and thought that Allan would frighten the birds through his clumsiness. Angry, Allan went back to the camp and got his fowling piece. He loaded it and started for the beach. He would show them that with his own weapon he was just as good a hunter as anyone else in camp, and he wouldn't have to crawl on his belly either. He marched ahead of the two hunters, and as he was crossing the shingled beach, the geese rose from the water. Confidently, Allan raised his weapon and fired, and missed. Not a single goose altered the rhythm of its wing flaps, and soon the dozen birds were a small black arrow flying out over the water. Uta and Eric said nothing, but it was plain that they were disgusted with Allan. Many days later, Eric pointed out that the best Allan could do with his fowling piece was to shoot one bird. After one shot, the rest of the birds would take to the air. On the other hand, the silent arrows might find their marks in 3 or 4 plump bodies before the other geese grew alarmed and took flight. The wounded birds, pierced by arrows, would stay afloat until a kayak rounded them up. Feeling very stupid, Allan was careful from then on to do exactly what any of the hunters told him to do. One task that Allan loved was to search the shores of the sea for driftwood, a job that the women usually did. Wood was a very valuable item for the whole camp. Straight pieces could be used to make harpoon handles or lance shafts, or work to make the runners or cross slats of a sled. Long curved pieces could be used in making the frame of a summer tent, although whale ribs were also used for that purpose. Wood was so precious, in fact, that it was never burned or thrown away. Even tiny leftover pieces were saved to be carved into toys for the children, dolls for the little girls, and play tools and weapons for the boys. When he searched for wood, Allan was usually accompanied by Panu, Eric's young sister. Panu was only 16 and quite beautiful. She had her brother's blue eyes and long, straight black hair. She often presented Allan with little presents, usually articles of clothing she had made for him. A pair of waterproof sealskin boots, or a double pair of caribou pants, or a caribou jacket with a deep, warm hood. Allan also went with Panu to gather seabird eggs, and they would spend hours together hunting for the nests of seagulls. But the main reason Allan wanted to look for firewood was that it gave him an excuse to search the sea for sails of a whaling ship. He still daydreamed of his home in Aberdeen, of his girlfriend Nancy, and sometimes he grew so homesick that he would have welcomed seeing even his old enemy, Bunty Duff. When Allan could, of course, he hunted with the men. When the hunters would not take him along, he stayed behind in the camp and helped the women, or talked to old Gerard, who no longer had the strength to go out and hunt. Allan often played with the children, and he taught them a few English words like snow, ice, cold, Nancy, and Aberdeen. The children were quick to use the English words, whereas the adults would soon give up and say it was impossible for them to pronounce the strange sounds. And from the children, Allan found it easier to learn the tribe's language. They would say a word endlessly until he could repeat it correctly. The adults, on the other hand, would become uncomfortable when Allan tried to speak their language. They felt that it was shameful for Allan not to be able to talk as well as a 4-year-old child, and they would lapse into silence rather than cause him any more embarrassment. Nor would they correct him when he made a mistake. It was not considered polite to correct anyone, but the children would howl with glee when Allan made a mistake and would quickly sing out the correct word or pronunciation. Sometimes, to please Panu or the children, Allan would take Nancy for a Sunday stroll. Arm in arm, the two of them would parade back and forth in front of the tents, Nancy waddling along, wrinkling her nose and sneezing her head off. In the meantime, Allan would be walking with his head held high, his belly pushed out, and a very stuck-up look on his face. The difference between his dignified walk and Nancy's comic waddle would have everyone in camp holding their sides with laughter. As summer passed and winter drew near, Nancy began to act strangely. Sometimes she would moan and whimper for hours. Sometimes she would leave the camp a little ways, and then look out over the ice and snow as though she were expecting someone to come for her. One night she woke up Allan with her moans and cries. He checked to see if there was anything wrong with her. Sometimes ice built up between the soft pads of her paws, and this would cause her pain. But her paws were clean. She kept on whimpering and licking his hands, and finally Allan made her leave the tent and go outside. Then he went back to sleep and forgot about her. Toward morning he woke up and heard her whimpering. She wanted to come back inside. He shouted at her to be quiet, and the whimpering ceased, and he went back to sleep. In the morning she was missing. Allan and Eric and Uta began to track her. They followed her for many miles until the tracks came to the open waters of a large inland bay. The bay was dotted with islands. The party did not have kayaks along, and it was agreed to give up the chase. Even with kayaks, they could search the many islands in the bay for months and never find her. At first, Allan was unhappy over the loss of Nancy. She had been such a faithful companion for so long that he had begun to consider her as another human being. But he knew that one day he would leave the tribe, and he certainly could not take Nancy on board a whaling ship. If he left her behind with the others, it was possible, even likely, that they would kill her during one of those hungry periods when the caribou were absent, when seals could not be caught, and even the fish were not to be found in their usual places. Though Allan knew in his heart that Nancy's return to her own kind was all for the best, he never stopped hoping that one day she would return to him. And for a long time after she left, every time he woke in the middle of the night, he would think of that early morning he shouted out to her to stop whimpering. It saddened him to realize that she had probably been trying to say goodbye, and he had been too stupid to realize what was wrong with her. It particularly saddened him to recall that his last words to her were angry ones. 1,000 times he wished that he could take those angry words back. And 1,000 times he looked out over the empty waste, straining his eyes in the hope that he would spot that lovable, familiar figure somewhere out there on the ice.